First of all, I just want to thank you all for coming and thank you all for hearing from me. I also want to thank my cheering squad who's come out for today. My brother and sister-in-law are here, and my dear friends, Mark and Marcel, and of course my husband and son, Colin. Thank you for being here. All right. I realized recently that when I pray, I speak to the God in my heart the way I would speak to a close friend. I see and hear him or her or it, the face and the body and the voice change depending on my needs at the moment, and I can see and imagine the way they move and smile and look at me when I speak to them. Sometimes she is an animal or an old woman. Sometimes he is a man. Sometimes it is a tree or a rock. They all speak to me in different voices, and I try to listen. I realize not everyone does this, that when they have a moment of prayer in the woods, they are not directly speaking to a mushroom who answers back with the slightly annoyed and disapproving tone of my deceased grandmother. Or when they have a conversation with God on the beach, they are not actually walking along and holding hands with a smirking but infinitely understanding apparition of Ryan Gosling. That's just me. I know that these manifestations of God are of my own internal making, and that others have different ones, or no images at all. That doesn't make them less real or less meaningful. It actually makes them more meaningful. These voices are deeply personal and profound for me. To mention engaging with voices in your head or calling upon other personalities within you is highly suspect and easily dismissed as crazy in our culture. A fragmented self is a sign of trouble. It's not a common way of thinking about ourselves or our internal lives or our spirituality. But I would like to argue that the voices in our minds are not madness. Rather, they are our closest and most profound advisors. The truth is that we all have different voices and different personalities that we call upon and who speak to us when we listen carefully. We use a different part of ourselves when we put our child to bed than the one we use when we're leading a meeting at work. We are different with our best friends than we are with a crowd of strangers. There's the home alone on the couch self and the going to a fancy dinner self. These different selves serve a very important function. They allow us to respond and adapt to different situations and different people, which is fundamental to our personal success and to the success of our species. The protector, the pleaser, the pusher, the perfectionist, the caretaker, the critic, the coward. We are all familiar with these tropes, these voices within us. The problem is that we are not always fully aware of how many we have coexisting within us at once. When one is speaking loudly, it can feel so fundamentally true that we forget to listen for the other voices within us, some of which might be speaking more closely to who we want, who we can choose to be. The beautiful and sometimes uncomfortable truth is that self is a construct, and as such is subject to manipulation and choice. The incredible superpower that is available to all of us is that we can consciously choose what and how we think, and we can choose what we do with that information. Psychologists, religious leaders, and artists have all been aware of the variable self for a long time. Neuroplasticity is the discovery that our brain changes and evolves throughout our lives, and we now know that changing our thoughts and behaviors can physically change the structure of the brain itself. Cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness practices, and most of the most moving music and art relies on our ability to transcend a fixed sense of self and become open to something bigger than that one voice, the ego that defines us. Now, the interplay between self and spirit and mind and environmental influence is a complicated matter, best left to spiritualists, scientists, and philosophers much wiser than me. I do know, however, that I have many selves, many voices which play off one another, conflict with, or feed whatever dominant personality I present to the world. We are amalgams of past and present and future concerns and needs, patchwork quilts of our ancestors, loved ones, enemies, and teachers, stitched over some essential framework which is impossible for any of us to specifically define, but fundamental somehow. Our cultural tradition of seeking to honor a single core, true self often discounts the many, many parts of us which conflict with that image but are nonetheless still true. and whether we like it or not, influence our daily thoughts and choices in subtle and not so subtle ways. Silencing or denying those voices, those influences and parts of ourselves, forces them into the shadows and can cause incredible imbalance and conflict within us. And just like many conflicts in the world, so much can be resolved simply through deep listening. If there is such a thing as a true or core self, I believe it is that part of us that can do that listening, that voice that can sort through all the other voices in our heads and help us to construct a balanced self, a self that allows us to exist in the world in relative internal and external harmony. I've been talking to my kids a lot lately about executive function, a skill that develops slowly and fits and starts in childhood and eventually allows mature adults to act like, well, mature adults. It's the system that keeps us from throwing our spaghetti on the floor, hitting others when frustrated, or taking off our clothes in church because it is so hot in here. It allows us to wait for the cookie, or to decide we don't need one at all, and to put the long-term goals and needs of others ahead of our own short-term selfish desires. I like to call it the boss in our brains. Like the Pixar movie Inside Out, I sometimes like to imagine our competing emotions as characters with personalities of their own. I like to imagine that we each have a little executive in our prefrontal cortex corner offices, trying to keep it all in balance. Like any good boss, executive function is responsible for managing a variety of especially challenging employees. Joy, for instance, is a real pleasure to work with, but she sometimes takes really long breaks or extended vacations, and then the boss has to figure out how to keep things running without her. Grief and disappointment are kind of a drag, but they need to have their perspectives heard and honored, or they can slow everything down to a crawl. Fear and anger can both be very helpful, and it's good to hear them out, but they can also be unpredictable and get easily carried away. Of course, we all know that love is essential, but she sometimes teams up with fear in ways that are not especially helpful. As a team, their ideas can be dangerous. The executive has to listen carefully to see if love is speaking with her own voice or if fear is speaking through her. Fear can be especially tricky that way. As a good boss, the executive needs to discern when someone's advice is worth taking and when it's best to respectfully overrule them. Follow your hearts, but your hearts can be complicated, noisy places. The worst voice for many of us, including my kids, are the bullies in our brains. Kind of the exact opposite of the boss in our brains. He or she or they don't really have any function in the company of our minds except to disrupt us, to keep us from becoming too successful or happy. They love to tell us how bad we are at things, about how unloved and unworthy we are. They are the voices that tell us that we will never do, have, or be enough. When these voices get too loud, they can grind things down to a halt. Fear and anger start to run amok, and Joy goes and hides in the bathroom, and it can take forever to get her out of there again. Everyone would love to fire the bullies, but they have lifetime contracts and can't be totally bought out. Luckily, when the boss is strong, the bullies can often be subdued and imprisoned in the office basement. At least temporarily, they do always manage to find a way out. I teach my kids to actively engage with these voices in their minds, to directly challenge their inner bullies, and to learn to not ignore grief when it wants to be heard. Some of us have really strong bosses in our brains. Some get really easily overwhelmed and find themselves compromised for a wide variety of reasons. Unbalanced diet, lack of sleep, lack of self-care, stress, trauma, chemical imbalance, all can weaken the bosses in our brains. And weakened brain bosses can be quickly overtaken by their unruly employees. We all know what this looks like. In my kids, it looks like tantrums and meltdowns. In adults, it can look like substance abuse, depression, anxiety, apathy, hopelessness, rage. The list goes on, but we all know it when we see it. Knowing and noticing the bosses in our brains well is the first step in keeping them strong. Some of you may know that I ran my first marathon this year. When I first decided to start running, I really struggled with a loud bully voice in my head that told me I hated running and that I was awful at it, that I would always be awful at it, and who cares if I was awful at it because running is awful and only self-hating crazy people do it because they want to torture themselves. As you can imagine, this voice greatly dampened my desire and my ability to run. I tried listening to music, but I couldn't drown it out. Running with friends helped, but the voice would always be in the background making me miserable. I wanted to run, but I hated running. What to do? Well, I looked for a different voice. I even went so far as to create a character for myself to use when running. I named her Kelly, with a heart over the I. An ex-cheerleader, Kelly was pretty annoying to my dominant self. She's not especially deep, and she doesn't really have anything interesting to say. But man, can she run. She loves running. It fills her with joy and energy, and she just can't get enough of it. So for a while, I let Kelly run, and Kari sulked along behind her. Every time my bully voice would speak up, Kelly's perky enthusiasm would drown it out. Fake it till you make it, they say. Well, I faked it as Kelly for about 2 months, until I finally had the confidence to run as myself again. I wasn't really someone else, though. Kelly is a part of me, one of my many voices, no matter how much I keep her hidden most of the time. As Walt Whitman said in Song of Myself, do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. Once there was a bachelorette party that I was obligated to go to that my dominant personality wanted nothing to do with. I didn't know the bride well, knew none of her friends, and she was 10 years my junior. The party was at a loud and obnoxious karaoke bar, where the entire idea was to get extremely intoxicated and make a fool of oneself. The drinks were fluorescent colors and were served in plastic buckets with many straws for sharing. My dominant personality hated this party. I sat in the back of the bar, sipping my grumpy old lady gin and tonic, silently judging every person in the bar as my inferiors. It was then that I realized I had 3 choices. 1, I could continue to miserably judge people until the nightmare ended. 2, I could leave early and hurt the bride's feelings. Or 3, I could bust out Kelly for a night and try to have some fun. In the end, I decided, though it might sound strange, choosing to be someone else for a while was the choice closest to my core self. Having fun at a frivolous party was not a compromise of my values. It was just a threat to my ego. So I took a deep breath, a final sip of my gin and tonic, and I jumped into the fray. Kelly had a blast. And after a few sips of fluorescent mystery cocktail, she even dragged me up onto the stage with the rest of the party to sing along to Achy Breaky Heart. This is something my dominant personality would not do in 100 million years. But I did it. And I had fun. Could I be Kelly all the time? Could I let her become my dominant personality? I don't think so. I think that would exhaust me and deny the other more important parts of me who need to be expressed. I can, however, lean on her from time to time, and that does not make me false. In fact, it brings me even closer to my true self. So much of our suffering stems from our over-adherence to ideas and voices and personalities that we believe are fixed and unchangeable. We limit what we believe to be possible within ourselves, and we tie ourselves to images of self that do not always serve us or our most deeply held values. What if we drew the circle wider? As Unitarian Universalists, we believe that our ideas about God can change, that our understanding of truth evolves, and with it, so do we. We believe in our own self-evolution and our power to change. What we sometimes overlook is that the force for much of that change lies within us. We all have the voices of our parents, our friends, our teachers, that one mean kid in 2nd grade, that boss who made us feel small, our grandparents, our siblings, the character in that book we loved, our imagination. All these voices and personalities influencing us, speaking to us, available to us to draw from or be diminished by. Sometimes they make themselves known at really unhelpful times. Sometimes they're exactly what we need, exactly when we need it. The trick is to really listen and to discern, to know who is speaking and to know what they want for us, and to make choices about when and if to empower those voices or let their words fade into the background. If you start to really listen, you might be surprised at the incredible wisdom and strength and courage of the voices you have within you. You might be surprised at their ability to support and sustain you when you need it the most, not just to cope with exercise or a terrible party, but to cope with loss and heartbreak and crushing disappointment and the sense of failure that dogs us all. For some, it is the voice of God that carries them through. For others, it is their conscience. For some, it is a lost loved one or the voice of a pet or a parent. I say give these voices depth and dimension. Notice them, dialogue with them, argue and laugh and commune with them. Give them names if you like and faces and get to know them. If one is saying the same thing over and over and over again to you, try to figure out why and what it is they really want for you. This is not insanity. This is dialogue. This is meditation. For me, this is prayer. Thank you.